So, chapter 1, verse 13, we're going to get through 4 verses today. Chapter 1, verse 13, 14, 15, and 16. So this morning, let's just jump right in. Chapter 1, verse 13, Peter is continuing on this theme of having hope. A lot of his letter stems from having hope. And so he writes here in verse 13, he says, "Therefore with minds that are alert, fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming." Now, this word "therefore," if you've grown up in church, you've probably heard the saying at some point. Whenever you see the word "therefore," you have to ask the question, what is it there for, right? So if you haven't grown up in church, that's new to you. As you read and read the scriptures and study them on your own, I am getting some weird feedback here. I feel like I'm talking out of a tunnel. As you read the scriptures on your own and take a look at them, one of the things you can do in order to sort of better understand what the writer is writing about, what he's trying to address, how he's trying to address it, is ask really good questions. One of those questions is, when you see the word "therefore," what is it there for, right? So, therefore is a connecting word. It connects the previous section that Peter wrote with the upcoming section that Peter wrote. And if you look back, verses 11 and 12, Peter is talking about how the prophets foretold about this coming Jesus and about this salvation we were going to have. Not only that, the angels look at this and can't take their eyes away from what God is doing in humanity. They are stunned. Their eyes are glued to this salvation. And so, therefore, because of what the prophets thought about this, because of what the angels think about this, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober. Peter goes on, he says, because of how the prophets and angels think about this, we ought to take a really good, close, hard look. The church should pay careful attention to the orientation of our lives and orient them towards the gospel. We should have a gospel motivation for all that we say and do. When we're motivated by good news or the gospel, things will start to look a little different. So, because the prophets and even the angels take a keen interest in what God is doing through and in humanity, we, the church, ought to as well. But how? Well, the NIV writes, "Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober." I love the English Standard Version translation of this. If you're ever looking for a good translation, here's a heads up. The NIV, the New International Version, does not usually translate word for word from the Greek, all right? It takes the ideas, typically, and translate those ideas so that they're a little bit easier to understand. Instead of taking a Greek idea and translating it into English, it takes a Greek idea and translates it into an equivalent English idea, okay? The English Standard Version, the ESV, takes a little bit more of a word-for-word approach, right? So, when we read this, I love how the English Standard Version translates it from the Greek. It says, "preparing your minds for action," right? The NIV says, "with minds that are fully alert." The ESV says, "preparing your minds for action." Now, literally, what we're supposed to see here, wow! Your timing is off, right? When I say the word action, that's when it's supposed to get unbelievably loud. Should I just do this? Would that be better? She's fooling. Oh, okay. Well, until then. What a great day to be in church and have all kinds of challenges. At least they're just sound challenges, right? I mean, if you have to have challenges somewhere, the sound is the least of the bad options. we are intended to see here what Peter wants us to see. The Apostle Peter, who, by the way, used to be a fisherman, so he knows a few things about this. We are intended to see an Eastern worker preparing for activity, right? A guy who uses his hands, works outdoors, maybe could possibly be working indoors, but they're preparing themselves to do something that is active, right? So how do they do that? Well, the Greek literally means to tuck the loins of your, it would be the tuck the loins of your garment up to prepare. Like, because if you're going to be, so they wear these long flowing tunics, right? And these long flowing tunics get in the way if you're going to do something active, right? So the way they prepare to do something active is they gather up all that extra material and they tuck it up into their belt so that their legs can move more freely without getting tripped up in these long flowing tunics, right? So this is the picture we're meant to see, except Peter adapts it a little bit and says that we are the way he would put it is to tuck up the loins of your mind. Right? In other words, prepare your mind to do something active, or prepare your minds for action. Right? So, there are two pictures of this that we can actually see in the scriptures, and I want to point these out because I think these will do well for us to really get a good visual for what Peter's talking about. The first is in Exodus chapter 12, where Israel is told to celebrate the Passover in a fashion so that they could be ready to leave at a moment's notice, right? So Exodus chapter 12 tells us all about how they're supposed to prepare the meal and then eat the meal. And then verse 11 says this. It says, "This is how you're to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." In other words, eat this meal, enjoy it, but be ready to move at a moment's notice because freedom is on its way and you want to be prepared to walk out that door as soon as it happens, right? So Peter borrows this picture and adapts it to Christians living in northern Turkey. That wasn't called northern Turkey at the time. Put it another way, it is almost time for you to go on a very long walk, and you will want to take what you can carry, and it may involve running at some points, so get yourselves ready. Be ready at a moment's notice because there is an experience of freedom that is coming on a scale that you cannot imagine, and you need to be ready for when it is time. This is the picture we're meant to have in reference to our minds. Because Peter says, prepare your minds for action. The second picture is in Luke, Gospel of Luke chapter 12. And this is a picture of servants who are working, actually in this case, they're working in a home. And Luke writes, stay dressed for action. This is again borrowed from the ESV. Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning. Verse 36 says, and be like men who are waiting for their master to come home from the wedding feast, so that they may open the door to him once he comes and knocks. We're meant to see a picture not one of servants standing around looking out the window so that they can see when their master is coming and then scurry off and grab a broom and start sweeping a little bit or make it look like they're busy while their master was gone, but rather one where the servants are actively engaged in maintaining the house and preparing for their master's return. So this is not a picture where they scramble real quick and fluff some pillows and make a little pile of dust on the floor so it looks like they had been sweeping the whole time, right? The challenge with this is that weddings, back in these days, were a major, major affair. Someone gets married in your village, everyone in the village comes out. In fact, people probably come from neighboring villages and they all come to celebrate. These celebrations could last for like a week. People would come out. Now, the thing is that you go to this wedding celebration, you're there for a day or two, you engage in conversation, people from the neighboring village you haven't seen in months, maybe a year, and you start talking, and someone says, you're telling a story, and they say, I don't believe you. There's no way that actually happened. You say, it's true. I have the sword of what's his name from what's that place, and I got it back in the day when I was a young buck and I was fighting with the army, and I still have the sword. And they say, no way. You say, yeah, of course, I'll go get it and prove it to you. So the guy might run home and get, whatever sword or trinket or whatever it is that they're engaged in conversation with at some point during the course of that week-long celebration. So the servants, they don't have a heads up that their master is coming home. He literally could come home at any point in that week-long celebration just to pick up something or to stop by and see how things are going back at the ranch. He wants to pick up that little thing just to prove that his story really is true, right? The servants have no idea when the master of the home could possibly show up. There's no heads up. There's no texting. There's no, smoke signals even, right? There's no way to send a message to the servants, hey, I'm stopping by real quick. Can you get this ready? He could stop by at any time. So the point that Luke is making, that Peter borrows the image, is that the master could come home at any time. And you as servants don't want to be seen as lying around when the master walks in the door. So have your cloaks tucked up into your belt and be about the business that you're supposed to be about, so that when he does come back, he's not going to walk back and see all of his paid workers lounging around, watching TV, out in the back, throwing darts, whatever. If you're getting paid to do something, let your master walk in on you actually doing that. So, the other possibility is that the master could actually walk home in the middle of the night, right? He just decides, today was a rough day of celebrating. I want to sleep in my own bed. 2 o'clock in the morning, he stumbles home half asleep. What if his servants are all asleep and nobody's there to help him? There's no street lights, right? The only light he has is maybe if there's a full moon, there's enough light to sort of see the path. Once you walk into a home, where's the light? The only light he has is the light a servant comes with a lamp. If a servant comes with a lamp, he's got a little bit of light and knows how to stumble to his bed, right? Unless he has that, there's no way for him to, he's going to bang his knees, his toes, he's going to have bruises all up and down his shins the next morning. And so Jesus tells us through Luke, Peter reminds us, be like that servant who is always has his cloak tucked up and ready for action, even at 2 in the morning, right? So this phrase that Peter uses literally means gird up the loins of your mind. It's kind of a crazy construction. It's one of the things I get a little nerdy about this sort of stuff. I know, but it fascinates me. So the picture we see in Scripture really colors. It colors in how we see ourselves, preparing our own minds for action. An English idiom that is similar might be, hey, pull yourselves together. Your mind needs to be prepared just like these folks have had their minds prepared. There is a task at hand, and we need to start with having our minds prepared for action. Hey, do you want your family to flourish? Well, then prepare your minds for action. Do you want your businesses to succeed? Well, prepare your minds for action. Do you want more people to come to know who Jesus truly is? Well, then prepare your minds for action. Peter goes on and says, alert and fully sober. Now, this carries the idea of living soberly. The way you would if you were not consuming excessive amounts of wine, which is the drink of choice in the first century. Hence, living soberly, being self-controlled, you could say. embracing sound judgment in all areas of life. It means not having your mind cluttered up and confused, but having clear sense of thought and direction. Thinking clearly leads to acting quickly and decisively. All this is because you are preparing your minds for action. As you think clearly, you can shift the trajectory of your life to a future orientation towards Jesus. Peter once again refers to hope as he challenges the people who live in these 5 provinces on how to orient their lives so that they can live in light of that hope. Hope is always future oriented. You don't have hope in your past. You don't have hope that things will get better last week, right? You think, in light of how things went last week, I hope they're better next week. Hope is always future oriented, and Peter talks about having this hope in Jesus' return. So hope is always future oriented. It creates expectation, and it amplifies anticipation of something good and right coming out of something difficult and evil. What are you going through right now? What have you been swimming in the last week, the last month? There can be hope. It's not in your efforts, however. Hope, you're never going to change things on your own strength. Or if you do manage to change things on your own strength, you only get the kind of change that you can create. You only get the kind of change that you have the strength to create. And most of us here need the kind of change that is way beyond our own strength to create. And so Peter says there's hope for that. Peter is encouraging these Christians who are experiencing hardships on all sides to be prepared for whatever else might come in light of the future orientation they are now living in because of the expectation of Christ's return. Peter's fellow fishermen, we mentioned this guy in the first message in this series. Peter's fellow fisherman, John, who is his partner, writes this in 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. He says, "Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known, but we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." You know, speaking of being prepared, this was a long time ago, feels like in a former life. My activities before I was married included things like backpacking, rock climbing, winter mountaineering, that sort of stuff. And one particular time I had decided I was getting into like winter backpacking, winter mountaineering, and I had some gear and I wanted to sort of try it out to see how all this stuff worked. And so I decided to go for a hike up Mount Monadnock. Now, many of you, maybe you've heard of Mount Monadnock. Mount Monadnock, believe it or not, is the most hiked mountain in the world. Right around, well, I don't know about with COVID, but right around 300,000 people a year hike up Mount Monadnock in New Hampshire, Keene, New Hampshire, about an hour and a half, 2 hours away, right? Little note, before Mount Monadnock was the most hiked mountain in the world, Mount Fuji was the most hiked mountain in the world. You know what happened? They built a road to the top. So now everyone drives up there, right? So Mount Monadnock is the most hiked mountain in the world, with somewhere in the ballpark of about 300,000 people every year hiking up it. So I've hiked up it a bunch of times. I figure it's a safe mountain to hike up when I'm learning how to try new equipment, new gear. And so the only problem was, as it turns out, I decided to hike up in what became a record-setting blizzard. So I knew the weather was going to be bad. That was sort of the reason for going, because I'm familiar with the mountain. I know the mountain. And I figured I know how far I can get before I really need to sort of turn around. Except if you've ever heard of mountain fever, or summit fever, I should say, summit fever. That's the sickness you get when you're close to the top and you cannot turn around until you get to the top. So that. I came down with a really bad case of summit fever. So I started hiking up probably around noon or so. I got to the summit around 4. The winds were blowing on the summit at around hurricane force. Visibility was probably about here to the second pew, maybe the third pew in some cases. Now, the thing about when you're mountaineering, they literally have stacks of stones as markers for the trail. So that, because normally it's painted on the side of a tree, there's a little, what they call like a blue blaze or a white blaze. I was on the white dot trail. So there's white dots on trees and rocks. You can see where you're going. Up above tree line, they can't put a white dot on a tree. So they create these piles of rocks called cairns. And you go from pile of rock to pile of rock so that you know that you're on the right trail. The visibility was so bad, I would be standing at one cairn, I couldn't see the next one. So I'd walk a little ways, sort of, oh, there it is. I was gingerly, I couldn't leave the view of one before I saw the next. And now the wind was blowing so hard, I didn't have goggles, which this was sort of a learning experience for me. I would turn my back to the wind and to the snow and the ice. The snow would come around my hood, come in close to my face, melt by the heat of my face, then dribble down my eyelashes, and then freeze my eyelashes together. So I was literally having to go like this every once in a while to get the ice off of my eyelashes, right? Now the thing is, I'm not going completely unaware. I know it's going to be bad. I just want to see how well I do in bad conditions, right? I've read a bunch of articles, a bunch of books. I have a bunch of gear. I want to see how it all works together. That's why I'm doing this, right? I make it to the top, and I'm so thankful. I literally, there's a rock on the top. I literally straddle it, and I've got an ice axe in one hand, and I'm like, yeah, and then the wind gusts, and I almost get blown off the rock. And I'm like, all right, okay, I got to go. So I start heading back. I cannot find my footprints. The wind has blown my footprints, and I'm at a point where they've actually painted where to go on the rock, but you can't see the rock because the rock is covered with snow and ice. And I can't see my footprints because the wind has blown them all away. So I'm literally on the top of this mountain. I don't know which way to go because I can't see the next pile of rocks. So, by the way, this is not my endorsing this approach. This is just what happened to me. So I literally start crisscrossing the side of the mountain, figuring at some point I'm going to hit a marker. I'm going to find a pile of rocks at some point. Except that I started this process at 4. And it's end of January, which means it's dark by 4:30 where I am, because there's really dense cloud cover. I'm going back. I can't find any markers. I can't find any trails. I have no idea where. I don't know which way I'm facing. Because even if I knew which way I was facing, I still wouldn't be able to find a trail and know which way to go. So what do? I pick a direction and just start heading down the mountain. I have no idea which side of the mountain I'm on. I just go. Now, the problem with hiking in the snow when you're not on a trail is that snow builds up in drifts, right? And without realizing it, you can step on one of these drifts and fall into 4 feet of snow. And when you're standing in 4 feet of snow-ish, 4 or 5 feet, 3 feet, various times, it's tough to walk. It's tough to keep going. So I literally, I'm stepping in, I'm falling into my hips in some places, a couple places out to my chest. And because the snow is like really fluffy and light. So I'm like grabbing onto the tops of trees and pulling myself. Like tops of like scrub brushes and pulling myself, figuring out how to do this, how to make this work. 6 hours later, I'll spare you the details. 6 hours later, I come across a sign that says no trespassing. I've never been more thankful to know that I was illegally walking onto somebody's property, because that meant I was close to a road or a driveway or something. And I eventually made my way out off the mountain. Now, the question remains, was I prepared for that? I would argue yes and no. I clearly did not have the equipment I needed to do what I needed, to do what I wanted to do. But I had read a bunch of articles, I read several books, watched a few videos, practiced some knot tying, which was totally useless. My mind was prepared for what I had to do. And so I walked off of that mountain that night with all my fingers and toes. I did not have all the equipment I needed to have, and my next purchase was goggles for the next time I were to try something stupid. But I knew what I was getting into. I was sort of intentional about doing it because I wanted to understand better. My mind was prepared. There was a couple times I had actually built a snow cave for myself to get into to try to ride out the storm. About half an hour later, once I was in the snow cave, I was shivering. I know that, because I've read and I've studied, I know that shivering is part of the initial stages of hypothermia. And I think to myself, if I'm in the initial stages of hypothermia, I need a way to warm myself up. I don't have a way to warm myself up sitting in this snow cave. I don't have a stove. I can't boil water. I can't do anything like that. The only means I have of warming myself up is moving. I have to actually move to generate heat, which means I can't stay in the snow cave, which is actually why I ended up hiking out. And I figured, you know what? If I freeze to death on this mountain, I actually had this thought. If I freeze to death on this mountain, I would hate to freeze to death like this. I don't want someone to come around in the springtime and discover me like this. If I freeze to death on here, they're going to discover me like this, heading down the mountain. I don't care. This is how I'm going to freeze to death, like this. My mind was prepared. The rest of my body was not. But my mind was. And that is the reason I walked off the mountain at just after midnight that night. Crazy thing is, I actually walked up to a house. I saw everyone's, there was a couple houses there. I knocked on a door, and a little, 8-year-old kid answered the door. And I am like covered head to toe in Gore-Tex, and I've got this massive headlamp on my head. And he opens the door, and my headlamp's shining right in his face. He says, "Do you need help?" Yeah, kinda. So he went and got his dad. His dad actually was really cool. He brought me into the house, took all my layers off, threw them in the dryer, gave me some leftovers from their dinner that night, and let me crash on their couch. I would have been content for him to tell me where I was so that I knew where I had to go. But I shoveled them out that morning, and then he drove me to the parking lot. But be prepared for action. Prepare your minds for action. There is something to be said about being prepared. So, we have something to be prepared for. A future hope that will make the current circumstances a blurry memory. But we also have something to be steadfast in. Peter writes in verse 14, he says, "As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance." Now, this phrase, "as children of obedience," or "as obedient children," this is actually a Semitic expression describing not just their quality, the quality of these children, but also their nature. Now, considering the strong familial bonds that existed between family members in the ancient Near East, and really that part of the world still today is like this, to be a child of obedience was to be completely invested in obedience. It was a defining characteristic, like your nose, or the color of your hair, or the shade of your eyes. You can see if someone is a child of obedience by how they conduct themselves. If you were to stand me next to my dad, you'd be able to say, oh yeah, yeah, I can see the family resemblance, right? I look like my dad because I'm a child of my dad. If you're a child of obedience, you look like someone who's been obedient, right? So Peter begins this verse with this assumption. How can we be steadfast in our commitment to orient our lives towards Jesus? Well, there are three ways that Peter lays out to guide us that will help us to be children of obedience. First, he says, don't conform. Second, don't lose control. And third, don't live in ignorance. These will be rapid fire. So, in order to be children of obedience, first, don't conform. The Christian lifestyle is not to conform to the base desires that we formerly had before we came to know Christ. So, this is a passive Greek construction and is better translated, don't be conformed. In other words, the action happens to you, you don't happen to the action. You are conformed rather than conforming something yourself. So Paul writes along these same lines in Romans chapter 12. He says in verse 2, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, by the way. He says renew your minds, just like Peter talks about preparing your minds. In other words, don't let the world around you squeeze you into its mold, but let God remold, reshape your mind from within. You can think of it this way. Preparing your mind for action is not passive. You have to be intentional about what you are doing when you're preparing your mind for action. Or you could just be pressed into a mold that is not of your choosing as you are conformed to evil desires. I always think of this in terms of Play-Doh, right? The difference between Play-Doh and clay. When you allow external factors to apply pressure on your heart and your soul, rather than exerting your own pressure on them, you will end up conforming to the shape of whatever is easiest to relieve that pressure. In other words, you take a piece of Play-Doh and you put it into that Play-Doh machine, out comes a little piece of spaghetti, right? Or out comes, if you're really creative, a hamburger, right? The two buns with the burger and the lettuce, you put those all together, right? That is being conformed to a shape or an image. Or, as Paul writes it, you could be transformed, right? Clay, on the other hand, there is a sense of conforming when it comes to clay, but clay is formed. You put a piece of clay and you're making something. Clay is transformed by the touch of the master's hand. And clay is turned into something useful, like a pot or a mug or a bowl or something. This isn't a plaything like Play-Doh. Clay becomes something that is useful, something that is beautiful. The difference between being just conformed and transformed. So, you need a strength from within your heart, your soul, that is strong enough to exert its own force on those external pressures if you don't want to be conformed. That's the first thing. The second thing, Peter cautions Christians to control their desires rather than be controlled by them. Evil desires, this is the word epithemia that we mentioned that angels long to look, right? Evil desires, this is that same word. Peter used it in an opposite manner when he was talking with angels, but the point is that a mind that is preparing for action is one that sees these desires, knows them for what they are, and is steadfast in moving away from them. If you take a passive approach and are conformed, you are essentially pulling up a canoe on a dock and then not tying it off. Your mind is like that canoe that will drift out to the middle of the lake or wherever, based on wherever the water is going, based on wherever the winds are going. You're a canoe that's out in the middle of nowhere. But if you're intentional, if you're not passive, if you're not being conformed to the trajectory of the winds, and you're intentional about being steadfast, because we have something to be steadfast for, then you don't drift like someone who is blown hither and thither by the winds. The third thing that Peter mentions. Living in ignorance. So the first one was don't conform. The second is don't lose control. Third is don't live in ignorance. Having come to know God, these Christians no longer live in ignorance. This is my favorite one. But they have come to know God and His will. Ignorance, quote unquote, is a term the Jews used to characterize those who did not know the true God, right? The choice of wording may imply that many of Peter's readers are from pagan backgrounds. Peter used it many times, but one other time he actually used it in reference to Jews. It's normally used by Jews against pagans, but one time Peter, a Jew, used it addressing Jews. Acts 3, chapter 17. He says this, "Now, fellow Israelites, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders. But this is how God fulfilled what He had foretold." Peter had just healed somebody. And he was essentially being arrested for doing this. He was being brought into the Sanhedrin for questioning. They eventually flog him, beat him for it, right? Before he goes, he's going to have the last word because he's Peter. This is what Peter does. He leaps before he looks. And he refers to the Jews and their leaders, who he was about to go talk to, as ignorant. In other words, Jews use this term ignorant to refer to pagans who did not know God. Peter was using it the same way to Jews who were supposed to know God, but as he is calling them ignorant, he's suggesting that they don't know God. Not only did the Jews not know, your Jewish leaders are ignorant of who God really is. Those are the guys he's about to go have this conversation with. Wow. I mean, if you're looking to try to talk your way out of, that speeding ticket or talk your way out of that fine or that jail time, this is not how you do it. So Peter, a fisherman who probably was not that good of a fisherman, as we talked about in our first message, he was also named Simon, which means one who listens. And let's be honest, this guy was not a good listener. So he wasn't a good listener. He probably wasn't a good fisherman. And if you look at the way he followed Jesus, he was not really a great disciple either until after Jesus left. That's when, he really started to take off. He was this leap before you look kind of disciple. And he's calling the crowds of Jews and their leaders ignorant. Now, which it's just like, okay. The end of verse 14 is Peter challenging 5 provinces of Gentile Christians not to be defined by the desires they had before they knew who God really was. Instead, to be people defined by the future orientation their lives were taking because of the hope they now had in a God whose greatest desire was to draw close to them. God's greatest desire was to draw close to them. He wanted that so bad, He actually came to earth as a man and lived among them. Which brings us to verse 15 and 16. And this is where we draw close to closing. Verse 15 says this, "But just as He who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, 'Be holy, because I am holy.'" So God is first in this verse. He is first. So there is there is something to, where did I write this? There is something to be prepared for. There is something to be steadfast in. And there is someone to be close to. There is something to be prepared for, something to be steadfast in, and then lastly, someone to be close to. God is first described as one who, quote unquote, called you. This word implies that he is close enough for you to hear. God's people are to express God's nature in all the arenas of life, all the decisions, all the conversations, thought patterns, all of it. The new people of God have been called not to follow some abstract list of rules or of conduct, but something far more fundamental. To be close enough to God that you can hear him. That's the implication of this word. God is described as holy. You can begin playing something spiritual and help people think that we're almost done. Thank you, Lex. God is described as holy. Now, Peter reinforces this command by citing a phrase that is repeated several times just in Leviticus, and is probably a mantra of all sorts of religious elites in the day of Jesus, including the ones that he stood against, the Sanhedrin. I'm just going to pull one out randomly. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2 says, "The Lord said to Moses, speak to the entire assembly of Israel and say to them, be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy." Peter's quoting directly from Leviticus. What is that supposed to mean? Well, the basic idea of holiness in the Bible is that of separation. Separation from. So when God says that he is holy, what that means is that he is separate from something. He is different in essence from. There is a distance between the essential part of us that makes us who we are and the essential part of God that makes him who he is. He is holy. So the way it is used here, though, there's an emphasis, there's a sort of a nuanced meaning that often gets missed and misunderstood in many churches in many places. So this idea of separation is not being separated from something. It's being separated to something. Separated for something. So for instance, in the Old Testament, you have priests and prophets and holy people. We refer to them as holy men, typically. They are holy not because they're separate from other people, but because they're separate they actually have a role, a specific role with specific actions that they're supposed to take in fulfilling the task and the job that they have as a priest or a prophet or whatever. They are holy because they're separate for that task, for that role, for those duties that they have to fulfill. So when Peter says you are to be holy, and he's quoting Leviticus, be holy because I am holy. Leviticus he's actually reciting the ways that offerings are going to be made, the way that animals are going to be sacrificed. And then he says, be holy because you're supposed to be separated to this God rather than separated to the people, other people that are gathered in that region, right? You are unto God. Just as God is sort of so forget this idea that, so being separated from something else is sort of part of that. It's connected to it. Because whenever you draw close to one thing, you naturally move away from something else. But the emphasis here is, what are you drawing close to? What are you shortening the distance between you and that? What is that? And God says, be holy, shorten that distance between you and me, because I am holy, because I am separate. In fact, in case you didn't know, Jesus had a number of brothers, right? He actually had a brother named Judas. One of his brothers, his name was James. James was a leader of the church in Jerusalem. James also wrote a letter to those in Jerusalem to encourage them. In that letter that Jesus' brother James wrote, he said this, and I think he said it because he experienced it personally. James chapter 4, verse 8 says, draw close to God, and he will draw close to you. Right? So holiness, separateness, is not only in your hands. It's not something that only you do. It certainly isn't something you accomplish on your own. But as you draw close to God, he draws close to you. Holiness is sort of like a team effort between you and God. So Peter wants his readers to know and to understand that your minds, our minds, are prepared for action to God. The future orientation of our hope is in God. We live lives steadfast in God. In other words, being holy is not so much about what you avoid doing as it is about what you engage in. The world around you, how that has changed, and how you live out your values in front of others. 1 John chapter 2 tells us that holiness is a loving conformity to God's commands and to his Son. Now, how does this give us someone to be close to? Like I said, James chapter 4 says, be holy, or draw close to God, and he will draw close to you. And actually, I wanted to read one more verse from Hebrews as we wrap things up. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 18 to 19. Hebrews 7, 18 to 19. The former regulation is set aside. In other words, the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, is set aside because it was weak and useless. Verse 19, for the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. What is that better hope? Who is that better hope by which we draw near to God? It is the person of Jesus Christ. Like we mentioned last week, our hope is not in some future goal. The hope is not some event. The hope is actually a person. The hope is a person of God. His name is Jesus. Our hope is in a person named Jesus. And we have this hope because he came near to us in a person. As a man, he did not stay up on a throne somewhere up in heaven. He came to us. And if we draw near to him, he'll draw even closer to us. So the one who was separated from God on a cross experienced the separation we should have experienced so that we could be separated to God. Christ experienced our distance from God so that we could experience his intimacy with God. Jesus gave up the close relationship he had with the Father in heaven for a close relationship with us, humanity, so that the distance we experience from the Father because of our sin in heaven could become the close relationship that our Father has with us in heaven. God did that for us. Jesus is the person that future hope is in. And when he draws near to us, he's already drawn near to us. But if we draw close to him, he will draw even closer to us. That is the hope that Peter is communicating to Christians who are facing crisis on all sides. You may not have hope in your own circumstances. You may feel like that was the last straw this past week. You may feel like what you're going through, there's no way out. But I promise you there is hope. Hope is not that your circumstances will change, because they may not. Hope is in a person who came to us so that we can come near to God. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks and praise for your love, your goodness, your kindness. We give you thanks because you came near to us first. And whether or not we ever come near to you, you still loved us enough to come near to us. And so, God, as we munch on that for a little while, as we've mentioned in the past, mutter to ourselves about that, as we meditate on your word today, later this week, I pray, God, that we would internalize the ideas, that we have something to be prepared for, something to be steadfast in, and someone to draw close to. Give us strength this week and in the weeks to come. Bring us back next Sunday to your house with a friend. In Jesus' name. Amen. I will hang out for a few moments. If there's prayer that you want to have, anything along those lines, in the most COVID sensible way, I'll be available to talk. But if not, I'll see you outside for some breakfast sandwiches.